Thank you. Good morning. Thank you again, for coming for the day 2 of our session. Very pleased we have Professor Yiping Huang, the Dean of National School of Development at the Peking University. Yiping actually no need for introduce because he's a regular contributor and a participant to the update series. And Yiping actually was the very first director for China Economy Program. And even though he served a very short time, and before I took over, now of course we pass on to Yixiao now. So Yiping will speak the latest macroeconomic development, perhaps also highlighting the challenges and the policy solutions. And the policy solution, yesterday we debated on that one, from a very different dimensions, monetary, fiscal policies, and but the stimulus package. So everyone is looking for some kind of outcome from those policy measures, but especially in terms of perhaps the government goals, setting a 5% of a growth target for this year. But first quarter we know 5.2, second quarter 4.7, and then 4.6 for the third quarter. So trending down, but whether the current stimulus package actually can reverse that trend and therefore to reach the government target of a 5% growth. So all sorts of issues will be involved. So let's see how Yiping provide those answer and the solution. Thanks, Yiping.
Thank you, Ligang. I actually prepared a PowerPoint file, but I realized I sent the wrong one. The one I sent was I used for a conversation with Jay Shambo a couple of months ago when he was in Beijing. That was closely related to Professor Li Sanjun's presentation. So I thought it was very good to hear his very detailed analysis. But then Ligang said I'm going to talk about the macro issue. I thought I was going to talk about new stage of development. Anyway, then let me say a few words about what is happening in the macro economy. As Ligang just said, the economy has been slowing. But I can tell you the good news is October numbers show that data that are improving, especially those economic indicators close to economic policy. So you look at the financial indicators and the consumer spending, industrial production, and some of the investment activities in manufacturing. Even the housing sales start to show some signs of improvement. But I think the drag is still there. 3 things to watch out. Number 1 is the property sector will continue to be a drag. If it doesn't stabilize, it's still a big uncertainty we're facing. The second factor, which is also very important, is the contractionary effect caused by the local government. You probably heard many times the local government is facing a big financial constraint. In the past, especially during the global financial crisis, local governments often help central government macroeconomic policy. Whenever the central government say, well, let's go, everybody just rush. And that's why during the global financial crisis, the central government devised a 4 trillion stimulus package. The central government actually only came up with 1 trillion yuan. According to my colleague, Professor Justin Lin, the total spending ended up in 30 trillion yuan. The remaining, large part of the remaining was from the local government. So the local government used to be a very good hand in supporting the stimulus package. This time they could not because they don't have money. More importantly, they're actually creating a contractionary effect. On the one hand, when they don't have money, they cut back spending, including cutting the salaries of their employees. The second thing, which is even worse, is they try their own creative ways finding money. That's why they're checking everybody's tax payment records. For the past 30 years, they're trying to capture an entrepreneur from other regions to squeeze out some cash. And I visited the Yangtze River Delta and the Pearl River Delta local governments in Hangzhou and Guangzhou were busy at protecting their own entrepreneurs from other policemen from other places. So this is badly damaging the entrepreneurial confidence. So I think this needs to be stopped. The further thing, which I think is getting a lot of attention from the market participants, is Trump's new policy on China. 60% tariffs is already in the talk, but more is probably coming. And so I was in Hong Kong last week. Most of the investment banks are looking at least a reduction of GDP growth between 0.5 percentage point to 1 percentage point. If that's the case, then there is really a big question, what is going to happen? So I'm telling you, on the one hand, the macro policy has already turned, the economy looks like it's turning. And so it looks like the fourth quarter would probably do better than the third quarter. And if our goal is to achieve a growth target of around 5%, then that's probably not too far away from that goal. But the question, I think, is for next year. And the next year, as I said, that even if the macro policy continue to rise, there is a bigger question whether the three factors I just mentioned would drag the growth performance of the Chinese economy. As I said, I actually prepared to talk a bit about the longer term questions, because you said the next stage. I thought the next new stage is about the next few years, not the next quarter or something. There, the big question obviously is, well, whether or not China can continue to grow. There is always one strong hypothesis that China may overtake the size of the US economy in the next few years. And we were discussing with Professor Lin. He published a book called China Miracle about 30 years ago. And this is why he's celebrating 30 years of publication of his book. And he mentioned that in that book, they predict that according to market-based exchange rate measures, China's GDP would become larger than the US GDP around 2030. He still believes that's the case. But there are many other people now thinking otherwise. And Biden certainly said when he came to power, everybody thought China was to become bigger than the US. And he said, now nobody talks about it. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. But Larry Summers recently said that maybe in the future, when we look at economists' forecast for the Chinese economy in 2020, the same way we look at the forecast for the former Soviet Union in 1960 and the forecast for Japan in 1990, and you know the story for these two. So he was basically saying there is a possibility that China might not be able to become bigger than the US economy. The question there obviously is about sustainability of your growth. And the question is, even if you were successful before, can you continue to succeed in the future? That's an open question. About 5 years ago, our school did a work with the Brookings Institution, which was actually coordinated by Yao Yang, David Dollar, and myself. We tried to look at China 2049, what will happen in the next 30 years compared to the last 40 years. And I can summarize 3 key findings or the key possible changes. Number 1 is the loss of low-cost advantage. Number 2 is population aging. And number 3 is deglobalization, or the change in the globalized environment. That's something I think really these just pointed to the need for creation of a new growth engine. If the Chinese growth in the past, which was very successful, really depended on low-cost advantage, input-driven, now we need to rely more on innovation. So the question is, can we innovate? If you look at the thesis of Michael Porter from Harvard Business School, he looked at the national innovative capability, basically look at two sets of determinants. Number one is your input. So scientists, technicians, and so on, and then R&D spending. On that front, I think China is probably doing okay if you look around the world. Number two, the second set of value, which is a bit trickier, that's more the factors determining the productivity of your input. So he listed the factors like IPR protection, openness of the country, and also dynamism of the private sector. I think these are the issues we needed to watch very closely. Openness of the country is becoming a very big challenge at the moment, especially because of the geopolitical tensions and the restrictions, not just by the other countries, but to some extent also by ourselves, whether that would hinder exchange of ideas and scientific research. That's a big challenge for us. The second challenge is the dynamism of the private sector, which is always very important for innovation in China. According to Wei Sangjing and Zhang Xiaobo, the private sector contributes something like 70% of Chinese innovation or the patents, which really means only if the private sector is dynamic enough, we'll continue to have innovation. But that obviously is also a big challenge at the moment. So I think if you look at the current setting of the environment, the economy has been doing reasonably well. But the question whether China can succeed with the new growth model is something that we should really look at very, very, very seriously. I planned to talk a bit about the EV sector, but Professor Li already gave you the story. So I will just summarize my own story. In April, Janet Yellen visited our school, and the first thing she said is that, well, your new green energy sector is becoming too big, especially the EV sector. She actually visited one of the automobile industry company before she came to Beijing. And she said to the locals that the Chinese are like competing with us in a very unfair way. So I'm going to Beijing to fight for your interests. I told her, well, we only exported 10,000 units of the EVs last year. And those were not like local brand names. So the impact was probably not material if there is an impact. But for her, obviously, that's not her concern. She basically said two things, as I mentioned just a minute ago: state subsidy and state direction. That means you created a very gigantic EV industry, which now becomes very competitive, but to some extent, it poses unfair competition to industries outside the world. And as you all know, after she went back in May, the US government put 100% tariffs on imports from the EVs. Then I realized it's probably not about the state subsidy or not about the material impact on the automobile industry in the US. It was probably related to the presidential election. But anyway, that's another issue. So then I looked at what was happening in the EV industry in China. The first thing I cited Professor Li was, if you look at the central government subsidy per unit of EV, China was in the middle. Norway and the US were way bigger than the Chinese subsidy. That's the first thing. But then obviously, Jay Shambo, that's why I had a conversation with him. He cited a study by CSIS in Washington saying the Chinese industrial subsidies were about 5% of GDP. That's about 10 times of the spending by the US, I forgot, Japan, Germany, maybe Brazil, and so on. So implication is that maybe your explicit subsidy is a limit, but your implicit subsidy is massive. I actually also had a conversation with the CSIS team when they were doing this study about 5%. When I left the Citigroup 15 years ago, that was actually one of my research area, i.e. the distorted factor markets, reduce the factor cost was an implicit subsidy in the Chinese economy. But the way I looked at, and I think many Chinese economists look at, the cost distortion exists. But the purpose of the cost distortion was to facilitate the so-called dual track liberalization. When you open up the door for the private sector to grow, the state sector will find itself in a difficult situation. But the government wants to maintain the state sector, therefore you need to provide some kind of subsidy. The government didn't have a lot of money to subsidize. The way they did it is increase the subsidy through reduce the factor costs. So 5% might be a reasonable number. I actually published an article in the Asian Pacific economic literature and other journals. My number 15 years ago was very similar to the number they found today, about 5%. So I wouldn't dispute their number, but I would dispute their interpretation. The reason why we had this distortion is mainly to subsidize implicitly the state sector, not to subsidize these already very competitive private sector. And I asked the Americans and the Europeans, who actually are competing with you in the international market? State-owned company or private-owned company? Most of them are private-owned companies. So if anything, the so-called production subsidy or the distorted factor costs actually benefit the state sector, actually make the private sector even in more disadvantaged position, if that's the case. So I think the interpretation of that 5% really needs to be corrected. But having said that, and I think Professor Lee also hinted on that, we do have very major investment programs by the local government, and in the form of like cheap land use fees and some other forms. That was probably quite a significant amount of money. And I think that is responsible for the reason why you have like 70, 80 EV companies around the country. And I talk to industrial people, most of them think the number is too big. We probably will be happy if we end up with like 3 or 5 companies across the country. The reason why you have so many companies across the country is because every municipal government wants to have their own EV company. And that, I think, is creating some problems. The good news, I'm not sure if this is good news. The good news is that local governments do not have any money, so it will be harder for them to continue to provide subsidy. But the latest, the third plenum of the 20th, the Party Congress also explicitly prohibit irregular and illegal industrial subsidy by local governments. So either way, I think we're moving in the direction that the local government subsidy will be substantially reduced. There was always like, there is a bureau called the Industrial Investment Promotion Bureau in all local governments. And that is also being transformed. In many places, they're commercializing the local operation. My sense is that, so this, I think, just points to the fact that number one, I think the Chinese companies can innovate if they're in the right position, create the right environment. But number two, I do think our industrial policy needs to be improved. Now, particularly the local government activity. And I think industrial policy is probably useful, but only useful when you're trying to use it to overcome the barriers. I.e. to overcome market failures. When the local government utilized to reproduce already existing capacity, that's not very helpful. So this is very important. In terms of the size of the industry, I also think we need to look at it very closely. When you have an industry this big, and obviously you can argue with the foreigners that we are competitive, we are efficient, and we low cost That's why you complain. Jay Shambo's response was, when you're too big, the problem is you don't leave any room for the others to grow. That, I think, is something we need to consider. When you're a small country economy, it's not an issue. When you're a big country economy, you really need to be careful about the room for everybody to grow together. And I think particularly Professor Li's finding about the supply chain, Ligang just mentioned, that's also something I think we needed to think a bit about it. When you have all your supply chains within your country, the good thing is it's a complete system and you can control it. The bad thing is that other people feel that they're not a part of it. And that's why I think the frictions will become a bigger going forward. So this is something I think we needed to look at very closely. And I also think for a country as big as China, we should not be very happy that we only have 3 new things. We should actually have 300 new things or 3,000 new things. That points to the role function of the state direction. I think that needs to be substantially reduced. Finally, I will just share with you a very preliminary proposal I made about in late May. In late May, there was a conference on Bretton Woods at 80 in Hangzhou. At the conference, I made a proposal for the so-called the Global South Green Development Plan. Some international media later call it the Chinese version of the Green Marshall Plan. The idea is that we already have a huge capacity. And we are also facing restrictions in the US and the European market. The question is, what are we going to do about it? If you cannot find a place to sell your products, they all become excess capacity, overcapacity. But at the same time, I think we also realize a lot of developing countries also need these products because they also needed to do green transition. If you look at the reports from the latest COP29 conference, you're actually finding the Chinese are actually doing a pretty proactive job, while the US and possibly also Europeans withdrawing a little bit. I heard that the Trump administration will probably withdraw from the Paris Club again. Whether that's true or not, that doesn't matter. But my proposal is that maybe we can devise something similar to a Marshall Plan. If China can provide market-based investment, policy lending, and direct aid to support the global South in the green transition, maybe there will be a need for the Chinese products, or maybe the Chinese production capacity moving overseas, helping everybody in green transition. At the same time, obviously, it would also help the Chinese macroeconomy and hopefully to absorb some of the already existed the capacity. This is a very rough idea. I have no idea whether the government will actually implement. But the interesting thing was about 2-3 months earlier, Brian Deese, I'm not sure if you heard about him. He was the former National Economic Council director from the White House. He left the White House last year and now is at the MIT. He wrote an article in Foreign Affairs saying the US should do a clean energy Marshall Plan. I was very excited. I thought we could do together, but then he said, we're going to compete with the Chinese because they're thinking about this green Marshall Plan. So the good news, and I should say the bad news is that with Trump coming into the White House, the US version of the Clean Energy Marshall Plan is probably will be on hold for some time. But whatever the case, I think China probably should do it. That's my proposal. Thank you very much.
Development, and so maybe I can just raise the question first. You specialize in the digital thing, so I'm wondering about the role of AI in driving the future growth in China against the background of aging and the rising cost of production.
Well, number one, if you look at the AI itself, China is actually very active. According to many rankings, China is probably number 2. Although the distance from number 1 is a bit uncertain. Some people say 6 months, some people say 3 months, some people say over time it's the gap is becoming wider. Doesn't matter. China has about 11% of the top scientists. The US has 60, so the rest will divide up the remaining. The AI is actively being exploited in the Chinese economy. And I work in finance. In the financial area, it's happening like everywhere. One thing I just would say is AI would provide a very unique opportunity for China to deal with the aging problem. Remember when Japan had the aging problem, Japan's GDP growth slowed quite significantly. Shirakawa-san, the former governor of Bank of Japan, came to our school last year, and he said that you look at the GDP growth between 1990 to 2020, Japan's GDP growth was at the bottom among G7 countries. However, if you look at the GDP per labor, the growth, the Japanese growth was actually topped the G7 countries. So his suggestion was, it's basically about the labor supply question. I mean, obviously many people disagree, including Professor Cai Huang. He thought the interpretation was not very accurate. But I think for us, it provides a very unique opportunity. When you're aging, at least the AI can help to mitigate the decline of labor supply. That's one part of the story.
Yeah, thanks. Yixiao,
Professor Huang for the fascinating talk. My question is on your Green Marshall Plan, which is a great idea and complements as a complementarity between China and the global south, which is green goods. I guess my question is the financing of it. So for these countries to use or purchase the goods produced in China, what do you think would be the way forward to finance these purchases?
Right. Well, if you look at the original Marshall Plan, the US government put out something like 5% of GDP at that time to support the European economies to revitalize. I don't know the exact numbers, but the Chinese government is number one, commit quite a big number at this China-African conference. The president said, I forgot the number, 6 billion or 60 billion US dollars in the coming years. But I think it could also be regarded as a combination of number one, macroeconomic stimulus, because you're trying to boost the demand. Demand could come from within China or come from overseas. But it could also be a part of this long-term bigger green development program. The money itself will not just come from the government. Now, I think it could be, as I said, market-based investment. If you encourage them, the Chinese companies, a lot of them want to go overseas now. The question is, where do they go? How do we facilitate these? The policy banks could also come up with the money. So the initial idea, when I said that the Global South Green Development Plan, it's about similar to the Marshall Plan, which means China will come up with most of the funding. But ideally, this becomes an international initiative because supporting green transition in developing countries is a global cause. It's not just for China. If other countries want to be a part of it, and obviously then you can source the product from around the world, not just from China. This will be a very big initiative, I think.
Sure. Yeah.
Just a quick question, Professor Huang. Want to get your comment on digital currency. To what stage it has happened?
Right. Yes, ECNY is already in a pilot experiment, but I think the problem is it's being experimented for 5 years now. It's still not yet rolled out. Part of the problem is because we already have very widely used Alipay and WeChat Pay in China. So the willingness to adopt another digital payment means ECNY is very low. I mean, Alipay is already very smooth, very efficient, and the user experience is also very good. So the additional benefit, and I would say actually use ECNY is less convenient compared to Alipay and WeChat Pay. That's something I think it's a bit difficult to be widely accepted when the mobile payment is already very well developed. Then the question is why you still want to do it. And I think there is a good reason why you want to do it. This is what I learned from Sweden. The Swedish society is already a cashless society, but they still want to do a digital currency, and mainly as what they call a parallel system. It's for the purpose of contestability, because all the mobile payment services are provided by the private sector. So if the central bank can put in place a parallel system, even if it's not widely used, it will be very useful to stop the private sector behaving not in the public interest, basically. Also, I think the bigger potential in the future is probably for cross-border payment. BIS helped the 4 central banks did this M-bridge, and that could help improve efficiency quite significantly. So I think that maybe the future, in the future, it will be more used in cross-border payment than in the retail payment.
Jen.
Really succinct and insightful as always. I want to ask you a dreaded question about GDP growth. I'm not going to make you give forecasts.
I don't make forecasts anymore.
No, but you know, we've got Justin for many years has been continuing to forecast very optimistically. I don't know if he's still in the 10% range, but he has been for some time. And then you mentioned Larry Summers, and of course he and Richard wrote that article now 10 years ago, Asia-phoria versus regression to the mean, and predicted then that China wouldn't prove exceptionalist and would instead revert to the mean. So 2 to 3% is not surprising what he is, I assume, still peak, so he continue to think he's right. But my question is, you know, in the context of the discussion today and what we read about in the press, so many challenges, as you raised, a lot of focus on the problems, a lot of people talking, including over these 2 days, about how to raise growth. But when I hear 4 to 5%, given the number of challenges that China's facing, I think, wow, that's pretty darn good. I guess my question is, say in the next 5 years, do you think China can continue to achieve something like 4 to 5%? Or if you don't want to go specifically into that pinpointing number, what is an okay level of growth? Given Richard and Summers' work, given that long-run trend of heading down to 2 to 3%, is 4 to 5% okay? And should we be worrying less, I guess, than we are? And on the flip side, I guess, celebrating how well they're still doing despite all those problems.
Well, Jen, you've been watching China for a very long time. I would respond in 2 points. Number one is true. The Chinese economy faces lots of challenges, probably more than in the past. But I will share with you, I've been watching the Chinese economy for more than 40 years now. And I can tell you that almost at every point of the time, I thought the challenge was significant. Challenge was significant partly because it's just a transitional phase. And the Chinese approach is a gradual reform. Gradual reform means you don't fix the problem once and for all. That's why you always see problems. But my way of summarizing the Chinese reform policy is what we often say pragmatism. This pragmatism includes 3 things, 3 steps. The first step is you have to devise a policy whatever it is, that you need to meet the what we call feasibility requirements. Some of the policies you think they're ideal, the best world, but you cannot like enforce it. And I think the shock therapy was probably one of that. It looks like you want to stop everything central planning, and tomorrow you wake up within an ideal world of free market, political democracy. But that just doesn't happen. So the first thing is feasibility requirement. The second thing, which is also very important and work for China, is that it's always result driven. You make a move and you look at whether it's been helpful or not, and what Deng Xiaoping called crossing the river by touching the stones. But the third point, which is also very important, that is you have to continue to push ahead the reform. So I think, Jane, if we are confident or if we are not confident, I will not worry about the challenges we face. I would worry about whether or not reforms will continue to move ahead. That's a bigger question. The second point I would also respond to you is 2-3% is probably a long-term trend, and that happens to every economy when you mature. But I think 2-3%, hopefully, is still quite far away from us. Because even though China is approaching the low end of the high income economy, like around, at the moment, we are probably 13,000 US dollars. That's still far away from the frontier economies. And I think there is still a chance that we can grow at this rate. But the question, obviously, is, as I said, it's not that whether China can continue to grow in that direction. The question is if we can continue to introduce policies that are necessary. At the moment, and I think that there is a big debate at the moment in China, or maybe in the past 6-12 months. What should be the policy priority? Structural reform or the macroeconomic stimulus? My own position was a few years ago, I was a strong supporter of structural reform, because if you don't reform, there will be no future of growth. In fact, I had a debate with Professor Huang in 2016. Your magazine, their magazine, actually published our debate. In 2016, I said that the key challenge, the reason why growth was slowing was there was an industrial upgrading. And if you don't facilitate the industrial upgrading, fiscal stimulus is not very useful. That was my position. But today, I certainly would first support more macroeconomic stimulus. And then, of course, to go on with the structural reforms. Some of our colleagues disagree, and they said, well, monetary policy and the fiscal policy are not very useful in resolving the fundamental problem, which I also agree. But my position is, if you have your patient in your ICU, what do you do first? Do you give him a membership card to a gym, or you're trying to rescue his life first? And I think at the moment, macro policy is more urgent. But then obviously you will say, well, I mean, entrepreneurial confidence is vital. If the confidence is not up, then even with the stimulus, it's not going to solve the problem. So my answer is a bit too long. I guess the key point I want to make is let's hope that the reform will continue. If the reform doesn't continue, then we don't need to discuss this question anymore.
Thanks, Yiping. Very quick question about price deflation, and actually happening whether the both monetary and fiscal policy has rectified this trend of price coming down.
This is probably a bigger worry for me than GDP growth. GDP growth is important, but our CPI, like last year, second half of last year, most of the months we had a negative growth. Yeah. This year it's hovering around 0. That's an issue because Japan offers a good example. When inflation is going nowhere, you actually could form what we call vicious cycle of expectations among consumers, producers, and investors. The risk is the economy will not grow. Nobody would accept the price increase. Therefore, there would be no increase in wage, income, and so on. So that is, to me, a big issue. In fact, my latest recommendation for macroeconomic policy is that at the beginning of the year, the government always announces two main targets. Number one is GDP growth at around 5%. And number two is CPI at around 3%. The government is very serious about 5%. If they don't achieve 5%, they feel a loss of faith. But if CPI is below 3%, they don't care. That's a problem, I think, in today's world. The good thing is Governor Pan Gongsun in his late speeches mentioned about the need to achieve moderate inflation. That's something I think we need to focus on.
Yeah. Very quickly, Larry and Ran and Christine. So very brief. Yeah, please. No, maybe you first.
Thank you, Professor Huang, for your presentation. So my quick question is, do you think China should follow the Japanese role of flying geese model to transfer its low-end carbon and labor-intensive industries to the other developing countries? Thank you.
Well, flying geese is always a very useful model, and it's already happening in China. Many of the labor-intensive industries are moving up. But I think our times are different today than like Japan's time several decades ago. I'll give you one example. Do you know the instant lighters, the plastic instant lighter? That is like sold for 1 yuan per unit. So you smoke? Yeah, everybody knows, right? That was originally from Europe, and then was in Japan, and then was in Wenzhou, and then moved to Hunan, Shaoyang, the place. And because of the rising production cost, and they had to shift because it's so cheap, you can't sustain. In Shaoyang, the story changed because they want to move it somewhere, but it was difficult because of what Professor Li said, the supply chain. That plastic instant lighter is a very cheap, simple manufacturing product, but it at least has 16 parts coming with it. So you actually have suppliers to go with you. And if the supplier is located too far away from you, you lose competitiveness. That's why they tried Southeast Asia, they tried South Asia, they tried Western China. Yeah, at the end, they relocated a part of it, but most of it still remained in Shaoyang. But the way they did it is to digitalize, automate the production process. In this 1 yuan, like guess how much is the labor cost today? You want to take a guess?
2.
2 what?
Who's that?
No, 1.
I know. Labor cost too high, right?
Yeah, but now because you automated, so the cost of this 1 yuan product is 3 cents.
3 cents. Yeah. Yes.
That's why you can stay for a while.
Right.
So I'm saying flying geese is still happening, but technology may change the pattern or the pace of it.
Larry, quickly, very brief.
Yeah, great talk and discussions. So we are talking about sustained economic growth. So you were talking about innovation. So this is mainly on the supply side. What about the consumption side? Yesterday I was talking about the consumption. China consumption, the share of consumption out of GDP is really low, about 50%. And China is now moving to aim to move to the high from middle income level to high income status. If you look at all the high income countries, the consumption account for about 70% and 80% of
Yeah.
So this is I think this is a bigger barrier to the future sustained economic growth. What is your review about that? Thanks.
Well, the first point to note is that most countries relying on export-led growth, relying on labor-intensive manufacturing products, i.e. East Asian economies, Japan, NIEs, and so on. all experienced a period of declining consumption share of GDP, and then hit a point and then start to rise. So I think in that way, China might be a bit extreme in terms of the level, but the pattern itself is not exceptional. We hit the bottom in 2010, which was 47% of GDP consumption. The latest number was 56%. So this number one was a usual pattern. But we probably had additional barriers, The reason why consumption is not rising was because income distribution, household income share of national income was a bit low. Income distribution was a bit unequal, and the social security is not very well developed. So these are the areas we needed to improve, including the urbanization. One thing not many people noticed is actually from between January 2020, the beginning of the COVID, to August this year, the household accumulated something like 65 trillion yuan bank deposits, which is equivalent to 9 trillion yuan US dollars. For those who followed the US debate about the inflation, you probably will notice when Larry Summers said at the beginning of 2020, when there would be a big inflation problem in the US, one factor he pointed to was accumulated household bank deposit by the US household at around 2 trillion US dollars. And that caused the big jump of consumption and the big jump of inflation. So the question in China is, households have some money, but they don't spend. So that comes back to I think the confidence question.
The very last question from Christine.
Thank you. This is
Yeah.
I had hoped to follow Jay. I want to come back to the issue of what do you do now, short-term stimulus or structural reform. Now, I've been looking at the Chinese economy a bit longer than you.
Okay.
People call it crossing the river by looking for stones, and that's certainly, I tend to call it putting out fires. When there's a fire that needs treatment, they do that, especially in public finance. And I remember a workshop about 10 years ago, close-door workshop with some finance ministers.
Yeah.
And those who had said, in 1994, there was the tax sharing reform because the central government was desperate.
Yeah.
And right now we're not desperate. That was 10 years ago. My question is there any sense of urgency, in Zhongnanhai at the very top? Are they feeling desperate about the fiscal situation, about the national economy? And if you look at the fiscal stimulus that's been explained so far, put on the table that we can see, there's no sense of urgency. We're tripling out 2 trillion a year. So what is your sense of how they are thinking about the need for both structural reform and short-term stimulus?
Big topic, very brief.
I have no idea, Christine, what the top leaders are thinking about, because I don't talk to them. But I think that number one, if you look at the policy turn from the end of September, it was very decisive. In fact, I met somebody the other day. They visited the PBOC and then came to my office. And I asked them about the meeting, and they said they were not very impressed. I said, why? They said, well, the official used the term incremental policy. Incremental policy sounds not very impressive, right? Step by step. But I said, in Chinese, that's called 增量政策. 增量政策 really means additional policy, not the incremental policy. But I checked, it did say incremental policy. So maybe there's something missing lost in translation. But I think this is very decisive, at least in terms of the macroeconomy, they're becoming very serious. structural reform, in fact, the reason why the government was not implementing big stimulus package was because they thought that reforms were more important. So I would not necessarily say they're not emphasizing on the reform, especially, for instance, the private sector. Last year we had this private sector economy, like 31 articles. Now they're trying to put together a law to promote the private sector. The third plenum also had long paragraphs emphasizing the need to ensure equal competition, fair competition, and equal entry treatment for the private sector and so on. The problem, I think, is that the entrepreneurs see all these good documents coming out of Beijing, but they're not 100% sure this is going to happen, or this is going to happen on daily basis, especially because of the local government behavior I just mentioned earlier. So I think there is a gap, whether that's something they will feel much better, unless I think the authorities do something really to convince the market and the entrepreneurs that we are very serious about this policy document. Just the final word about the fiscal condition you mentioned. I think, I mean, you know better than I do. This gap between spending responsibility and fiscal revenue for the local government has been a long-lasting problem ever since 1994. In the past, the local governments were able to resolve the problem by creating new revenue sources like land sales, local government investment vehicles, and so on. But now these doors were shut. And that's why the local government is in a desperate position. What should I mean, in fact, you probably also know about a bit over 10 years ago, there was a wide discussion about the new fiscal reform. At the time, many people, including myself, sense was maybe the central government should decentralize some of the revenues to the local government. But then Lou Jiwei became the minister, and his idea is instead of decentralizing revenue, you should centralize some of the spending responsibilities. Did it, but it did not solve the problem. My own sense is when we look at the fiscal policy, stimulus versus reform, I think the first step now we need to do is to generate or provide enough general purpose fiscal revenue for the local government next year. While the government is trying to swap the debt for the local government, these are all very important. For some local mayors, they told me that the thing that made them sleepless in the 90s, they don't have money to spend tomorrow. They don't have money to pay their officials tomorrow. That's something I think we need to fix. And I hope in the 2025 policy package, there will be a part of it just to provide enough money for the local government to maintain their daily operation. Then I think we should focus on the more longer term structural fiscal reform, including realignment of the central-local fiscal relations. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Yiping. So with that note, let's conclude this keynote session. So please join me in thanking Yiping. Before we I'd like to invite Yixiao to conclude the whole update.
So thank you very much, everyone, for joining this conversation with us. Just borrow Professor Yiping's words. To innovate, we need to stay open. I hope over the past 1.5 days, we have, through this engagement in this open forum, and updated our understanding about the Chinese economy, have deepened our understanding of China's energy transformation, and hopefully that has helped you in certain ways. And we walk away with some new knowledge and new learning, and that's our purpose. So I hope to thank our contributors who travel all the way from China, from Singapore, and also from USA for the longest travel. And it's a we really appreciate your input, and without you, we wouldn't have this great conversation over the past days. And also, I hope to thank all the participants who joined us, who stayed with us, and hopefully you can help us spread your understanding about China and learning about it, and that will be really appreciated. We hope to see you back next year around the same time, and also we have our book from this. So each of the participants, contributors will have a chapter to be published in the upcoming China Update book, and it's published by the ANU Press. It will be available for free download from ANU Press website, and also we will have hard copy around. So that should be around later next year. But we do have a new book upcoming in December. That's based on last year's China Update. So please stay. Please follow us, and we hope that will benefit your work and study and life. Thank you.